She didn't come west to be found. She came to disappear into the wind, into the silence, into a place where no one would look too closely at the woman with trembling hands and a belly full of consequence. But the land noticed her. It watched her every step, every breath, every mistake, and in its harsh, unyielding way, it began to answer the question she couldn't stop asking: can a broken woman build something whole? The snow hadn't come yet, but the Wyoming wind already carried the kind of bite that hinted at winter's approach. Isabel Clark stepped down from the creaking wagon with a faded carpetbag in one hand and the weight of too many unfinished prayers in the other. The driver looked at her like she was mad when she pointed not to a house, but to the empty stretch of land beyond the post office. "Ain't nothing out there but frost and regrets," he muttered. She paid him anyway. She stood alone on the edge of 40 acres of wind-beaten prairie, purchased with the last of her father's inheritance and every coin she could scrape from the ruin of her former life. There was no welcome, no handshake, no safety, just wind, silence, and dirt. Isabel was 6 months pregnant. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she wore silk gloves and attended garden parties in Charleston, when her husband whispered promises over fine china, and the world bent kindly around her in subtle, flattering ways. Then came the silence. Then the letter. Then the hush in her family's drawing room when she told them she wouldn't be returning to her marriage or to them. She didn't tell them why. Pride, perhaps, or shame. Or maybe she already knew that a woman who lost her husband through anything but death lost more than her home. She lost her place in the world, but she didn't come to Wyoming to mourn that loss. She came to carve something out of the nothing that remained. The land office had offered her a plot no one else wanted. Too exposed, too far from the town proper, too dry. Isabel saw it and thought perfect. She didn't want neighbors. She didn't want pity. She wanted space. She wanted silence. And so she began. Her hands were untrained, her body aching under the weight of new life and old mistakes. But there was something strangely sacred about the work, the way the hammer hit the nail, the way the boards lined up straight when she focused hard enough. Each movement hurt. Each movement healed. She started with the foundation stones, dragged from a nearby creek bed, one by one, until her shoulders throbbed and her back screamed. She bled. She cursed. She cried without making a sound, and the land watched. She wasn't the kind of woman who knew how to survive in the wild, but the wild didn't seem to care. It demanded everything she had, and then asked for more. At night, she slept inside a frame of timber too short to hold heat and too open to keep out the wind. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and whispered lullabies to the unborn child inside her, hoping it couldn't hear the tremble in her voice. She missed warm baths, butter, books. She missed the woman she used to be, but only in the way a child misses fairy tales after learning the world doesn't hand out happy endings. By week 3, her hands had hardened. The blisters turned to calluses. Her clothes no longer fit, but she learned to tie them differently. She found that if she stood just right, the mountain range in the distance looked like protection instead of a barrier. She rarely looked at her reflection in the shard of mirror she carried, but on the morning of the first frost, she caught her own eyes and didn't flinch. That felt like something. She didn't know if she would survive the winter. She didn't know if she would survive childbirth. But she knew one thing. She would rather die building a life of her choosing than live another day trapped in someone else's dream. The mornings came earlier now. The wind no longer whispered through the grass. It howled. It tore across the prairie like something wounded, something ancient. Isabel Clark rose with it, just before dawn, her fingers numb before she even reached the door. The cabin frame stood like a stubborn prayer against the horizon, half-built and skeletal. It was too small, too drafty, too crooked in places where the planks refused to cooperate. But it was hers. She lit the small fire she'd rigged beneath the tarped shelter and boiled water from the creek in a blackened tin kettle. Her breath fogged in the air. She cupped her belly as she waited for the water to warm. The baby was still, but she'd begun to know its rhythms active after she ate, calm when she sat by the fire humming old hymns. It was the only audience she had, and somehow the most forgiving. By now, Isabel had grown accustomed to the pain, the dull ache in her lower back, the sharp pull of muscles straining to do what they weren't built for. Her palms were rough, covered in shallow cuts that never quite closed, but her hands had become tools now honest and hardened. She had learned more in 6 weeks than in all her years of finishing school. She could mix mortar and set stone. She could fell a tree badly and split its trunk into beams. She'd memorized the sound of a level beam, the groan of one misaligned. Her body paid for every mistake, but she made fewer of them now. There were moments, just before dusk, when the wind paused and the golden light washed over the clearing, when she could see it, what it might one day be, a cabin, a hearth, a porch where she could sit and watch the child play beneath the sky, a root cellar to keep the potatoes cold through the long white silence of February. It wasn't much. It was everything. She didn't expect anyone to see it. Not really. She wasn't building a legacy. She wasn't building a statement. She was building survival. That was enough. But on the 7th Thursday, she kept track in chalk marks on the log near the well. The world sent someone anyway. The sound of hoofbeats reached her before she saw him. Her first instinct was fear. No one came out this far unless they were lost or dangerous. She set the saw down and wiped her hands on her apron, dust streaking her cheeks as she shaded her eyes against the sun. The rider approached slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. He wore a wool coat the color of smoke, a worn hat tilted low. His horse was too fine to belong to a homesteader. She knew enough now to tell a working gelding from a parade animal. This one had muscle, training, and care. So did the man riding him. He stopped at the edge of her clearing and touched his hat, eyes scanning the half-built cabin, the stacked lumber, the woman with a belly too round to be mistaken for anything but expecting. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, touched by a drawl so faint she almost missed it. "I'm Gabriel Hartley. My family runs the West Hollow Ranch about 10 miles north." She nodded slowly, her heart a tight fist in her chest. Isabel Clark. The silence stretched awkward between them as he surveyed the scene. His gaze lingered on the lumber piles, the uneven roof frame, and finally her face sweat-slicked, hair braided back, fingernails black with dirt. She looked like everything she'd once been taught to avoid becoming. He dismounted. "I saw smoke a few days back. Thought maybe someone was stranded. Didn't expect to find." He hesitated, then smiled, sheepishly. "Didn't expect to find you." She didn't return the smile. "I'm managing just fine. Mr. Hartley?" He raised his hands, palms open. "Not here to interfere. Just thought, well, you don't see many folks building alone these days, especially in your condition." Her spine straightened like the board she'd planned that morning. "My condition is temporary. My determination isn't." Something flickered across his expression. Respect, maybe, or surprise. She couldn't tell. "Well said," he replied, after a beat. "Still, I'd be happy to lend a hand if you need one. I've built a few cabins in my time, or at least helped my crew do it. I don't take favors. I didn't say it'd be a favor. Call it neighborly instinct." She stared at him, this man with the too easy smile and eyes that missed nothing. He looked like someone who was used to being trusted. That made him dangerous. "I came out here to be left alone. Mr. Hartley." He nodded again, but his gaze softened. "Understood. But sometimes being left alone isn't the same as being safe." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He tipped his hat again and turned back to his horse. Before mounting, he glanced over his shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think what you're doing out here, it's the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." And with that, he rode away quiet, respectful, and gone. But the words stayed behind. Long after the hoofbeats faded, long after the light dipped below the horizon, and that night, for the first time in weeks, Isabel dreamed not of escape, but of what it might feel like to be seen and not judged. Gabe Hartley returned 3 days later. Isabel heard the horse before she saw the man. A quieter gait this time, as if the animal had been trained not to intrude, like its rider knew silence had value here. She was on the roof, kneeling over a crossbeam, hammering shingles one at a time. She didn't pause when he called her name. "Miss Clark," he said, standing beside the ladder she'd wedged into the frame. "That's dangerous work, especially in your condition." There it was again, that phrase, so neatly wrapped in concern, so full of doubt. She set the hammer down slowly and looked down at him, shielding her eyes against the sun. "I've been climbing trees and fixing things since I was 10. I didn't stop when corsets were expected, and I'm certainly not stopping now." Gabe blinked, then chuckled. "Fair enough." She watched as he steadied the ladder, not asking permission. His grip was firm, but not possessive, like he was prepared to catch her, not claim her. The sky stretched endless behind him. That kind of blue didn't exist back east. "What brings you back?" she asked, resuming her work with practiced rhythm. "Checking my fences. Your ridge cuts close to our southern line." He paused, "But mostly I was hoping to see if you were still standing." A nail slipped, slicing her knuckle. She didn't flinch. "I'm not fragile. Mr. Hartley." "I never said you were." Silence stretched between them. She heard the creak of leather as he leaned a shoulder against the half-finished frame, content to stay grounded while she hovered 10 feet above. "Look," he said finally, "I'm not trying to meddle, but if you fall, there won't be anyone around to help. And if something happens to you, what happens to the baby?" That one hit harder than she expected. Isabel sank back on her heels, wiped sweat from her brow, and exhaled. "I don't want to owe anyone anything," she said quietly. "Not a meal, not a ride, not a rescue. I'm not asking you to." His voice was softer now, but helping someone doesn't have to come with a ledger. She looked down at him again. "That hasn't been my experience." He nodded slowly, accepting the weight behind her words without pushing for details. Then, just as quietly, he said, "You can be strong and still let someone hand you a hammer." Her lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but close. "Do you even know how to use one?" Gabe's grin spread across his face. "Ma'am, I may own the finest horse in 3 counties, but I've dug post holes in frozen ground and splinted cattle legs in rainstorms. I know my way around more than a saddle." The breeze caught her braid and lifted it slightly. She adjusted her stance, the baby shifting low in her abdomen. "You really that bored up on your ranch?" He shrugged. "Maybe I just like watching you prove people wrong." That made her pause, not because it was flattering, but because it felt like the kind of truth someone didn't say out loud unless they meant it. She climbed down carefully, each rung deliberate, and stepped into the dirt beside him. They stood closer than strangers, not yet friends. "Then if you want to help," she said, "hold the shingle stack while I cut the next row." He did, without a word, without a grin, just steady hands and quiet presence. For the next 2 hours, they worked. No stories, no question, just the rhythm of shared labor. Gabe handed nails. She hammered. He adjusted the frame. She smoothed the joints. By the time the sun reached the edge of the clearing, the cabin had a roof. Not perfect, not pretty, but solid. When they climbed down, Isabel sat on the porch's unfinished edge and pressed a hand to her side where the baby kicked in protest. "You okay?" Gabe asked, crouching nearby. "Just sore. She's got strong legs already." He raised an eyebrow. Isabel smiled. A real one this time. "Just a hunch. Stubbornness feels familiar." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I brought you something." From his saddlebag, he retrieved a small bundle wrapped in rough linen. Inside were a pair of knitted baby booties and a pouch of dried herbs. "My mother's doing," he explained. "She heard there was a woman out here going it alone. Said no baby should come into this world without something warm and something soothing for her mother." Isabel held the tiny booties in her hand, blinking down at them like they might vanish. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't hand them back either. That night, long after Gabe had ridden away and the sky burned down into stars, Isabel tucked the booties under her pillow, and for the first time in months, she didn't fall asleep with her jaw clenched tight. She fell asleep wondering what kind of man noticed a woman's strength and didn't try to tame it. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge, Gabe had become a fixture not daily, not expected, but somehow inevitable. He never stayed long. Sometimes he brought nails, or rope, or dried apples from the ranch pantry. Once, he left a fresh-killed rabbit hanging from a post. No note, just a quiet gesture that said, "I see the gaps you're not asking anyone to fill." He always kept a respectful distance, never crossed the threshold of her cabin, never asked about the past. But he came when the sky darkened early, when the creek froze at the edges, when the roof sagged slightly under frost she hadn't anticipated. They talked rarely of themselves, mostly about the land, the animals, the way the wind shifted right before snow. It was enough. It was more than she'd let anyone give her in years. She didn't know what to call what was growing between them. It didn't bloom like something planted. It crept in like moss soft, quiet, stubborn. One afternoon, they split wood together. Gabe wielded the maul like a man who'd done it his whole life, sweat rising on his brow despite the cold. Isabel stacked each half log carefully, her movements slower now, deliberate. The child pressed low in her body, shifting her center of gravity and balance, but she wouldn't give in to it. Not yet. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, watching the sun crawl across the snow. Gabe paused, leaned on the handle of the maul. "Used to. Thought I'd end up in Texas or Colorado. Somewhere with big sky and little expectation. But I stayed." He looked at her. "Turns out the sky's big enough here." She didn't answer, just kept stacking. Later, as dusk poured over the valley, they sat on the porch, unfinished, like everything else, but solid enough to bear their weight. Gabe passed her a cup of hot tea he'd steeped over her small fire. "Tell me something true," he said. She looked sideways at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "Seems fair. You built this whole life on grit and silence. I figure I've earned at least one truth." She considered him. The way his jaw tensed when he was nervous. The way he didn't flinch when she met his eyes. "I'm scared all the time," she said. He didn't react, just sipped his tea. "What about you?" she asked. He leaned back, stretched his legs. "Truth, I was supposed to marry Victoria Marston next spring. Our families decided that before we had teeth." Isabel blinked. "Your engaged was, I don't know. It's a contract, more than a connection. Victoria's sharp, beautiful, born to throw dinner parties and raise prize foals." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She deserves someone who sees her." "And you don't. I see too much," he said quietly. "And not enough of what I'm supposed to." The air thickened between them. Isabel's hands wrapped around her cup like it was the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Then Gabe said something that cracked her heart open. "When I saw you swinging a hammer with one hand and steadying your belly with the other, I thought God help the man who ever underestimates her." She didn't speak. She couldn't. He stood then, slowly, as if he knew he'd gone as far as she would let him. "I'll be back Thursday. Storm's coming. I didn't ask for your schedule," she said. He smiled, soft at the edges. "Didn't give it for your permission." That night, the baby kicked so hard she gasped. For a moment, it felt like the child was trying to remind her of something her own pulse, perhaps. Or maybe the fact that despite everything she'd lost, this was still hers. She wrapped the small blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared at the door, wondering why she missed someone she'd never invited in. The following week, she let him fix the draft beneath the window. Didn't ask. Didn't thank him. Just handed him the hammer. He didn't smile. He didn't tease. He just said, "Pass the nails." When he finished, he wiped the dust from his hands, walked to the table, and pressed his palm against the wood grain she'd sanded down the night before. "You know," he said, voice low, "this is more than shelter. You're building a future that doesn't beg permission to exist. That's rare." Her eyes met his. "So are you," she whispered. They didn't touch. Not then. But the space between them shifted just slightly like the first hairline crack in ice before the thaw. She should have told him sooner. But how do you tell a man who looks at you like you're rebuilding the world with your bare hands that the world you left behind is still shackled to your name? It happened the day after the second snow, The wind had blown down a corner of the fence, and Gabe came to help her reset it. They worked in silence, side by side, like they always did until she handed him the hammer, and their fingers brushed. He didn't let go right away. Neither did she. It was the first time their skin truly met. Not for necessity, not for balance, just because it felt like they had arrived at that moment slowly, honestly, without permission, but with purpose. And then she said the words that unraveled everything. "I was married," she said softly, as if the wind might carry the truth away before he could catch it. "Still am. Legally." Gabe froze, the hammer gripped in one hand. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "Charles Whitmore, Charleston. We married in 72. He left when I told him I was pregnant. Accused me of lying. Never signed the papers. I left with what I could carry and didn't look back." Silence. Long, punishing silence. Then Gabe exhaled, slow and steady, like a man who'd just had the air punched from his chest. "That's the child's father?" he asked. She nodded once. He doesn't want her, but he doesn't want scandal either. When she finally looked at Gabe, she expected judgment or disappointment, maybe even anger. What she saw instead was grief. Not for her, for them. He placed the hammer on the ground and rubbed the back of his neck. "You should have told me. I know. I wouldn't have turned away. I know that too. That's why I didn't." His jaw clenched. "That's not fair." "No," she said. "It's not. But I've learned not to trust kindness that comes too quickly." He opened his mouth, closed it again. The words wouldn't come. And then, without another syllable, he mounted his horse and rode away. She didn't cry. Not then. But the sound of his hooves fading into the distance cracked something inside her that had held steady through everything else. The next visitor arrived 2 days later. But this one didn't come with supplies or warm eyes or a steady hand. Victoria Marston. Isabel saw the carriage long before it stopped at her gate, sleek, black. Too elegant for this patch of hard land. Victoria stepped out in a fur-lined coat, her blonde hair tucked beneath a velvet hat. Her gloved hands curled around a parasol that had no purpose in this weather other than decoration. She didn't smile. "You're Miss Clark, I presume," she said. "I am," Isabel replied, bracing herself. "My name is Victoria Marston. I believe you've become acquainted with my fiancé." That word landed like a blade. Not because Isabel didn't know it was true, but because hearing it spoken aloud made everything she'd tried to pretend wasn't real. Real. "I came to clarify a few things," Victoria continued, "and to extend an offer. If you leave now, your name stays clean. No scandal, no whispers, no trouble." Isabel's pulse thudded. "I haven't done anything wrong. Your existence is enough." Victoria's smile was cold. "You're a woman, visibly pregnant, living alone. He visits you. People notice. People assume. Assumption becomes accusation. You'll ruin him. I never asked for his help, but you took it. Repeatedly. And don't act like you didn't see the way he looked at you. Like he belonged here." Her eyes swept the cabin with disdain. "In this half-finished ruin." Isabel stiffened, fingers curling into fists. "This ruin is the first thing I've built without anyone's permission, including his." Victoria's voice hardened. "Then finish it alone. Quietly. Far from here." "What if I don't?" Isabel asked, already knowing the answer. "Then the Marstons will make life very difficult. For you, for him, and for the child." She left without waiting for a reply. That night, the storm rolled in. Snow slammed sideways against the windows. The wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin's frame like it was mourning something. Isabel sat by the fire, wrapped in every blanket she owned, holding the knitted booties Gabe's mother had sent. She stared at them for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, she placed them gently back into the box, shut the lid, and slid it beneath her cot. The next morning, she began boarding up her heart the same way she boarded the windows. When Gabe returned a week later, he looked different. Thinner around the eyes, older by years he hadn't lived. "I heard about the visit," he said, standing at the edge of her porch. Isabel didn't invite him in. I didn't ask for it. She said, I know. Did you know she'd come? He hesitated. That was enough. She turned away. Isabel, he said. But she stopped him with a whisper. Don't? He stepped closer anyway. I don't care what they say. I don't care about inheritance or politics or propriety. I care about you. About her. He looked toward her belly. Let me be here. She shook her head slowly. You can't fix this with warmth. Gabe, you can't outlove a town full of wagging tongues. You'll drown trying, and you'd rather drown alone. She didn't answer, because in that moment, her silence was the only thing strong enough to hold them both upright. The storm came hard and without mercy. By dusk, the wind was no longer a sound. It was a force. It howled through the cracks of the cabin like it had come to undo her. Snow swirled outside in frantic waves, erasing the trees, the sky, the path to anywhere. Inside, Isabel was pacing. Her back ached in pulses now. Not the slow, dull ache of labor preparing, but sharp, rhythmic pain. She tried to ignore it. She stoked the fire, boiled water, moved the last stack of firewood near the door. She hummed lullabies she didn't quite remember the words to, anything to outpace what she knew was coming. Then came the first real contraction. It bent her in half. She gripped the edge of the table. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. When it passed, she stood still, trembling. The world had narrowed. There was no more cabin, no more wind, no more memories, only her body, and the impossible task ahead. Another wave hit this one longer, deeper. She counted seconds, tried to remember the midwife's words from a book she'd read by lamplight weeks ago. They're coming fast. Too fast. No time. Her hands moved on instinct. She laid out the linens, checked the water, draped towels near the fire. She folded a quilt beneath the bed, placed the knife in boiling water, lit every lamp she had. The baby wasn't waiting. She was alone. A part of her had always known it would come to this giving birth, not in a hospital or with a hand to hold, but here, with snow pressing against the walls like a closing fist. She knelt beside the bed when the next contraction hit, crying out loud for the first time in years. It wasn't just pain. It was rage. At Charles, at the silence, at the way every choice she made still found a way to punish her, at her own strength because she was so damn tired of being strong. Another wave, another breath, another sob she didn't have time to finish. Then hooves. She thought it was a hallucination, but then came the sound of boots hitting snow, a fist pounding on the door. Isabel Gabe. Isabel opened the door. She couldn't stand. She couldn't speak. The latch lifted. The wind exploded into the cabin, and then he was there, snow-covered, breathless, wild-eyed. And when he saw her curled beside the bed, he dropped to his knees so fast the world blurred. Oh, God! She shook her head, barely able to form words. You shouldn't be here. I should have been here sooner. He took her hand. She didn't resist. What do you need? He asked, voice low, urgent. She gasped as another contraction tore through her. You, just you. I'm here. He didn't ask for permission. He just moved. He rolled up his sleeves, checked the water, steadied her breathing. She watched him from the corner of her eye, how his hands shook just once before finding purpose, how his voice stayed steady even when hers cracked. I've helped birth colts and calves, he said softly, like a promise. We can do this. She nodded, tears streaming freely now, not from fear, not even from pain, but from the miracle of not being alone. Time vanished. There was only heat and agony, and Gabe's voice, constant, calm, telling her she could do this, that she was doing this, that she was brave, that she was strong, that he had her, he had her, he had her. And then the child came into the world, fists clenched, voice fierce, a girl. She's perfect, Gabe whispered, eyes shining as he placed the tiny, wet body on Isabel's chest. Isabel sobbed not from relief, not even from joy, but from the overwhelming, uncontainable realization that she had survived, that they had survived, The child nestled into her, slick and warm, already rooting instinctively. "I named her Hope," Isabel whispered, still panting. Gabe smiled through the tears in his lashes. "Of course you did." He cut the cord, cleaned the baby, wrapped her in the soft cotton blanket he'd brought months ago, not knowing if she'd ever let him stay. Now he stayed. Long after the storm quieted, after the pain subsided, after the world began again. He held both of them, her hand in one, the child in the other, like they were the only things that had ever been real. And that night, while wind moaned low across the eaves, Isabel let her head rest on Gabe's shoulder and whispered the words she never thought she'd say again. "Please don't leave. I wasn't planning to." And for the first time in years, the word home felt like something more than a place. It felt like him. 3 days after Hope's birth, the letter arrived. Gabe brought it in from the storm. The envelope smudged with water and mud, the seal intact but already sinister in the way it bore the initials she thought she'd left behind. "Subu." Isabel sat at the table, Hope nestled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in the cotton blanket that still carried traces of Gabe's scent pine, wood smoke, leather. She didn't want to open the letter, didn't want to touch it. But silence never kept a man like Charles Whitmore away for long. She unfolded it with shaking hands. "You are still my wife. In the eyes of the law and the court, your public disgrace is a stain upon the Whitmore name. If you do not return to Charleston immediately with the child, I will initiate proceedings to have her declared mine and raised within the family legacy. This is your final opportunity to redeem yourself through compliance." She read it twice, then 3 times, and then she rose, handed Hope to Gabe, who took her like she was made of starlight, and walked outside into the snow barefoot, just to scream. Inside, the fire crackled low. Gabe sat on the floor, the baby sleeping against his chest, her tiny hand curled into the fabric of his shirt. He didn't speak until Isabel returned. "I'm not going back," she said simply. "I know, but he's right about one thing. I'm still married. I never finished the paperwork. I thought if I left, that would be enough." Gabe nodded. "It should have been, but it wasn't." She sank down beside him, wrapping the quilt tighter around her shoulders. The silence stretched, but not unkindly. "I'll lose her," she whispered. "He'll use every coin, every lawyer, every loophole, and if a judge decides he has rights, she'll be taken from me." "Then we leave," Gabe said. She blinked. "What Colorado territory?" "My cousin runs a small ranch near Denver. They don't care much for Charleston names or fancy Eastern husbands. They've got their own problems and their own laws." She stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're serious? I've never been more—" "But your family, your inheritance. I don't want a life I have to keep apologizing for." He looked down at the baby. "And I'm not letting anyone take her. Or you." For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Isabel leaned into him, and Hope, and the warmth between them that had taken so many storms to create. "Will it be enough?" she asked. Gabe kissed her temple. "It'll be ours." That night, while Hope slept swaddled in a crate padded with blankets, Isabel and Gabe packed what little they owned: a skillet, a pair of boots, the letters Isabel had written and never sent, the cross from her father's desk drawer, the cradle he had helped her carve, a bag of silver coins buried beneath a loose floorboard. She left the rest: the cabin, the tools, the roof that barely held. It had given her a place to survive, but now she wanted to live. At dawn, they hitched the wagon and wrapped Hope in every warm thing they owned. Snow glittered along the trail. The mountains loomed like ghosts ahead. Gabe looked over his shoulder at the clearing where their story had started. "You sure?" he asked. Isabel took his hand, steady and unshaking now. "I'm not running," she said. "I'm choosing." And with that, they rode west toward the unknown, toward freedom, toward a future written not by courts or bloodlines, but by courage, by hope, by love. 3 years later, the garden was in full bloom. Rows of lettuce stretched beneath the Colorado sun, and green beans climbed their stakes like they were racing toward heaven. Isabel knelt in the soil, her hands dirt-streaked but steady, as her daughter squealed with delight somewhere behind her. "Mama, I found a worm." Hope's voice, bright and breathless, carried across the field like laughter. Isabel looked up, shielding her eyes with the back of her hand. Gabe was standing near the shed, watching their daughter dangle the earthworm triumphantly. He grinned, then caught Isabel's eye and winked. This was their life now, a small ranch tucked in the hills west of Denver, a modest house they'd built with their own hands, a daughter who ran barefoot and fearless through the grass, the sun caught in her hair like gold. They hadn't made it rich, but they'd made it free. The letter came on a Tuesday, a plain envelope, dusted with travel. Isabel held it in her hands, heart still. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Charles Whitmore was dead. No trial, no fight, no final confrontation, just a name in black ink and a signature from a Boston attorney. She was free, officially, legally, publicly. But the truth was, she had been free for a long time. That evening, she stood on the porch with Gabe, Hope curled against her side, a blanket around their shoulders. The stars blinked awake above them. "We could get married now," Gabe said quietly. Isabel turned toward him, surprised. "I mean, really married," he added. "Ceremony. Rings. A piece of paper that proves what we already know." She smiled. "I don't need proof." "I do," he said. "Not for the law. For the little girl who's going to ask, someday, how this all began." Isabel looked down at Hope, fast asleep, her mouth slightly open, her cheek warm against her chest. "All right," she whispered. "Let's do it." And so they did. On a warm afternoon in June, beneath a tree they'd planted themselves, with neighbors gathered in folding chairs and the mountains rising behind them, Isabel Clark became Isabel Hartley, not because she needed a new name, but because she had finally found a life worth naming. Gabe said his vows with one hand in hers and the other resting lightly on Hope's shoulder. And when the time came for her to speak, Isabel said only this: "I was never saved by love. I saved myself. But love was brave enough to stand beside me while I did it, and that changed everything." Afterward, as the guests shared pie and laughter, Isabel stood back and watched. Gabe was helping Hope chase fireflies, his laughter ringing across the grass. The scene was simple, unremarkable, perhaps, to the world, but to her, it was holy, because it had been earned, because it had been chosen, and because it had been built not from what was broken, but from what had survived. In the quiet moments before sleep that night, as she traced the scar, still faint, on her hand from that first winter's work, Isabel understood what she wished every woman could know, that you don't need to wait for permission to begin again, that you are not your past, that you are not what was done to you or what you had to do to survive. You are what you choose, what you fight for, what you love, and when you build with your own hands, no matter how shaky, no matter how scarred, the thing you make is yours, fully, fiercely, forever. So, to you watching this story unfold from across the screen, if you've ever felt like your life fell apart, like you had to start over with nothing but heartache and grit, you are not alone, and you are not finished. Keep building, keep choosing, keep believing there's still something beautiful waiting to grow in you. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, leave us a comment below and share your favorite moment. Was it the roof, the baby, the storm, or the garden? And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, because somewhere out there, someone else needs this story. And maybe they need you too. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, sometimes hope doesn't come to save you. It comes so you'll remember you were strong enough to save yourself.